There is a particular kind of silence that exists in old money homes. Not the comfortable silence of two people who know each other well. Not the peaceful silence of rest. It is the silence of things that are never said, emotions that have no permitted expression, needs that learned, early and permanently, not to be spoken aloud. Children raised in these families describe something almost impossible to put into words: the feeling of being surrounded by material abundance and emotional vacancy at the same time. Magnificent homes, impeccable educations, every material advantage, and parents who never said, "I love you," who responded to tears with disappointment, who handed a child to a nanny at birth and saw them, with any luck, for an hour a day. From the outside, old money families look composed, dignified, admirably self-contained. And for generations, that composure has been mistaken for strength. But what if it isn't strength at all? What if the emotional coldness that runs through old money culture, the stiff upper lip, the suppressed vulnerability, the inability to express need, is not a virtue that was cultivated, but a wound that was inherited, passed from parent to child, generation after generation, wrapped in the language of discipline and class, but rooted in something much darker. Today we are going to go all the way to the bottom of this, the history, the psychology, the science, and the very specific mechanisms by which old money families have produced, for centuries, adults who cannot feel, cannot ask, and cannot be reached. This is not a story about bad people. It is a story about a system, and understanding it might just change the way you think about wealth, emotional health, and what we actually pass down to the people we love. The cultural architecture of emotional suppression. The emotional coldness of old money families did not emerge from nowhere. It was constructed deliberately over centuries by a cultural and institutional apparatus that treated the expression of emotion as a social liability, a moral weakness, and a class marker. To understand where it begins, you have to go to Victorian Britain, the single most influential source of old money's emotional culture, and a society that elevated emotional repression to the status of a national virtue. The Victorian era gave us what we now call the stiff upper lip, the cultural mandate that a person of standing should face difficulty, pain, loss, and even catastrophe without visible emotional disruption. Stoicism was not just admired, it was required, and this requirement was not equally distributed across society. It was specifically and deliberately enforced in the elite, in the families and institutions that produced Britain's ruling class. British public schools took inspiration from Spartan principles, emphasizing toughness, discipline, and endurance. Young boys from age 7 were taught that showing emotion was weakness, a philosophy that shaped generations of British leaders. This was not abstract philosophy. It was enforced through the daily rituals of elite boarding school life, through cold dormitories, corporal punishment, a culture of bullying so systemic it had its own vocabulary, and an explicit contempt for any display of vulnerability. Public school lexicon rudely warped words that conveyed strong emotions. To be hurt was to be stung. Crying was blubbing, a word of abysmal contempt. In Thomas Hughes's Tom Brown's School Days, a young boy is mocked by his peers simply for writing a letter to his mother. The message was clear. Emotional attachment to family was itself a weakness to be trained out of you. This attitude was partly a reaction to the perceived chaos of the French Revolution, where emotional volatility had led to social upheaval. The English ruling class watched the French aristocracy destroyed by revolutionary passion and drew a conclusion: control your emotions or lose everything. Stoicism in this framework was not merely personal preference. It was a survival strategy for a class that had seen what happened when the mob was roused. The result was a culture in which the most powerful families in Britain, and, by extension, in their American counterparts, became structurally incapable of emotional intimacy. Not because they didn't feel things, but because the culture they inhabited had defined feeling things as weakness, and weakness was the one thing they could not afford to display. The nanny system and the architecture of early abandonment. Before we can understand what boarding school does to a child, we need to understand what happens before boarding school. Because in old money families, the emotional detachment begins not at age 7 or 8. It begins at birth. The nanny system, the practice of hiring domestic staff to perform the primary caregiving role for children while parents remain formally, socially, and emotionally distant, was the foundational practice of the British upper class for centuries. It was not considered neglect. It was considered correct parenting. The dominant belief shared across the elite was that too much parental affection would spoil a child, that a child raised without emotional indulgence would be stronger, more disciplined, more fit for the responsibilities of class and leadership. The consequences of this belief were documented most profoundly by a man who experienced them firsthand, John Bowlby. Bowlby was born in 1907 to an upper-middle-class London family. His father was surgeon to the royal household. Bowlby was predominantly looked after by nannies and, as one of 6 children, found that he had little interaction with his parents. The ethos in his childhood home was that too much affection and attention spoils a child, so he found himself in a boarding school at the young age of 7. Bowlby recalled his school years as traumatic, and instead of suppressing that experience, as the culture demanded, he spent his entire career as a psychiatrist trying to understand it. The result was attachment theory, one of the most important bodies of psychological research of the 20th century. Attachment theory holds that children are biologically programmed to form close emotional bonds with a primary caregiver, and that the security or insecurity of those early bonds shapes everything that follows. How a person relates to others, whether they can trust, whether they can be vulnerable, whether they can love and be loved without fear or compulsion. Continual disruption or prolonged separation from the primary caregiver can result in significant long-term cognitive, social, and emotional challenges for the child. Now consider what Bowlby was describing against the backdrop of his own class. The upper-class nanny system meant that the child's primary attachment, the person they bonded to, reached for in distress, and depended on for comfort, was almost always a paid employee, not a parent. And when that nanny left, as they inevitably did since it was employment, not family, the child experienced an early loss of attachment that had no language and no acknowledged place in the household's emotional life. Bowlby's early years were spent under the care of a nanny named Minnie. Her departure when he was 4 years old caused him significant distress and a profound sense of loss, an experience he later reflected upon as foundational to his life's work. Bowlby's own mother, like many women of her class, saw her children for approximately 1 hour per day. In the drawing room, at 5 o'clock. The rest of the time, the children lived upstairs with the nursery staff. This was not aberrant behavior, it was the norm, and it produced, systematically, children who learned before they could articulate it that emotional need would not be met by the people who were supposed to meet it. That neediness was unwelcome, that the appropriate response to pain was to manage it alone. This is where old money's emotional coldness is born, not in some abstract cultural preference, in the nursery, in the hour-a-day mother, in the nanny who disappeared without explanation. Boarding school syndrome, the clinical reality. If the nanny system plants the seed of emotional detachment, the boarding school system waters it until it is the dominant feature of a person's psychological landscape. The term boarding school syndrome was defined by psychotherapist Joy Shavarian and has since been recognized as a genuine clinical condition, a specific pattern of psychological damage produced by the experience of being sent away from home at a young age to live in an institutional environment. Boarding schools have been a significant part of British education for centuries, often seen as institutions of privilege, discipline, and academic excellence. However, beyond their reputation, these schools can have profound psychological effects on those who attend them, particularly regarding attachment and adult relationships. What happens psychologically when a child of 7 or 8 is sent to boarding school? When the parents, already relatively emotionally distant, already mediated by nannies, deliver the child to an institution and drive away. A key issue faced by many former boarding school students is broken attachment. When children are sent to boarding school at a young age, they may experience a sudden and distressing separation from their parents. This phenomenon can manifest in adulthood as emotional detachment. Former boarders may struggle to express vulnerability or intimacy, having learned to suppress their emotions as a survival mechanism. Fear of dependence, the enforced independence of boarding school life, can make it difficult for individuals to rely on others or seek emotional support. The survival mechanism is the critical phrase, because what happens to a child in a boarding school environment is not that they stop feeling, it is that they learn rapidly under social pressure in an environment where emotional expression is actively mocked and punished, to seal off their emotional experience from their behavioral presentation. They build, in the language of psychology, a strategic survival personality, a persona that functions, performs, and succeeds in the environment, while the genuine emotional self retreats somewhere deep and largely inaccessible. This split is adaptive in the short term. It allows the child to survive the environment, but it becomes catastrophic in the long term because the persona hardens. The suppression mechanisms that were developed for survival become permanent. The child grows into an adult who cannot access their own emotional interior, not because they choose not to, but because the pathway was sealed so early and so thoroughly that they genuinely don't know how. The academic literature on this is stark. One paper in a peer-reviewed psychology journal proposed what the author called the British upper-class complex trauma condition, a formal recognition that this elite, comprising less than 1% of the population, has sustained fee-paying boarding schools and is sustained by them in a remarkably effective nexus of power and influence, and that this avoidant culture, with its severe affective limits and entitled assumptions, constitutes a form of group trauma. Group trauma, not individual pathology. A collectively experienced, institutionally reproduced psychological wound that has been mistaken for centuries for composure, strength, and class. How emotional coldness is transmitted, the intergenerational mechanism. Here is perhaps the darkest part of this story. The mechanism by which this emotional coldness perpetuates itself across generations is not conscious. It is not deliberate cruelty. It is the predictable outcome of damaged people raising children with the only emotional tools they themselves were given. The parent who was sent to boarding school at age 7 and learned that emotional vulnerability was shameful does not grow up and decide consciously to withhold warmth from their own children. They simply have no template for providing it. They were never shown. The internal model of parenthood they carry, the unconscious blueprint in Bowlby's framework, is one in which parents are formal, distant, and emotionally unavailable. And so they recreate what they know. They hire nannies because that is what their parents did. They send children to boarding school because that is what their parents did. They respond to their children's emotional distress with a kind of embarrassed discomfort, not because they don't care, but because they were never given permission to show that they care, and they have no idea what it would look like if they did. The recurring themes in wealthy family emotional dynamics are competition for family resources, high expectations from the wealth generator or controller, and a distant emotional bond with parents. The wealth itself amplifies the problem in particular ways. In a normal middle-class family, physical proximity, parents present at dinner, at bedtime, on weekends, creates incidental emotional connection. The relationship is built in the margins of daily life. In old money households, this proximity is systematically removed by nannies, by boarding school, by the culture of formal family interaction. The dinner table is not a place of casual intimacy. It is a place of correct behavior, appropriate topics, and the performance of family rather than the experience of it. Without credit institutions, families could grant loans through expanding social networks and strategic marriages. Parts of wealth, including real estate, art, and financial assets, are given as gifts to sons, and signing of shareholder agreements, prenuptial agreements, and inheritance contracts significantly shape the everyday lives of the super-rich throughout the course of their lives. Even within the family, relationships are structured around legal and financial instruments rather than emotional bonds. The relationship between a parent and child is mediated by trusts, inheritance conditions, and formal governance structures that introduce a transactional quality into what should be, at its core, unconditional. The result is that children in old money families often learn, without anyone intending to teach them, that love is conditional, that it is connected to performance, to compliance, to being the kind of heir the family needs, rather than the kind of person the child actually is. Wealth, trust, and the impossibility of genuine relationship. There is another specific mechanism by which extreme inherited wealth produces emotional coldness, one that is rarely discussed but psychologically devastating: the destruction of trust as a foundation for relationship. When you are heir to a significant fortune, every relationship you form carries an invisible question mark. Does this person like me, or do they like my money? Does this friend value my company or my access? Does this romantic partner love me or what I represent, the security, the status, the resources? This question, usually unspoken, but always present, fundamentally distorts the way old money heirs engage with the world. The rational response, developed over generations of experience with opportunistic relationships, is to maintain an emotional distance that cannot be exploited, to reveal nothing of consequence, to project warmth without providing access, to be pleasant without being known. For a fortune that size, the psychological impact can be devastating in the best of circumstances. Trying to find a sincere dating or marriage partner would be a real trick. This is not paranoia. It is a learned, pragmatic adaptation to a real problem. People with significant inherited wealth are targets for manipulation. They do attract relationships that are primarily instrumental. The coldness is, in this reading, a protection mechanism, armor worn so long and so early that it eventually becomes indistinguishable from the person inside it. The family's response to this problem, strategic marriage alliances, the vetting of partners through social networks, the use of prenuptial agreements to structure romantic relationships as they would structure any other financial arrangement, reinforces the same message at every turn. Emotional openness is a vulnerability, and vulnerabilities are dangerous. What this produces, over generations, is a class of people who are profoundly skilled at social performance, the manners, the conversation, the easy grace of those born to drawing rooms, but genuinely incapable of the kind of emotional exposure that real intimacy requires. They can charm, they can network, they can host, but they cannot, in the deepest sense, be known. The cost, what the coldness actually does to people. The emotional coldness of old money culture is often presented by those inside it as a virtue, composure, discipline, self-sufficiency, the ability to manage one's internal life without burdening others. But there is a human cost to this, and it is significant and largely invisible. Studies on the psychological experience of inheritors consistently reveal patterns of isolation, identity confusion, and chronic difficulty with authentic relationship. Many inheritors describe a feeling of profound loneliness, of being surrounded by people and known by none of them. The performance of composure, maintained from childhood, means that they have never practiced vulnerability. They have never learned the skills of emotional repair, how to acknowledge hurt, how to ask for what they need, how to tolerate the exposure of being genuinely seen by another person. The mental health implications are real and underreported. Old money culture has a deep stigma around psychological struggle. Seeking therapy is, in many of these circles, an admission of weakness that carries social consequences. So the depression, the anxiety, the attachment disorders, the difficulty forming lasting intimate relationships, these go unaddressed. They are managed with the same tools that were applied to every other difficult emotion: suppression, performance, and the maintenance of the correct appearance at all times. There is sometimes a chilly demeanor in old money individuals, surrounded by a neutral zone of manners and etiquette. They remain on an even keel, optimistic, focused, pragmatic, but self-indulgent, navel-gazing tendencies, what we might call genuine emotional self-examination, are much less common. Worrying about what other people think is almost non-existent, because old money knows who it is and isn't concerned about who knows it. That last part sounds like strength. And in some respects, it is, but it also describes a person who has so thoroughly closed off the emotional channel, who has so completely internalized the message that feelings are private and irrelevant to one's social function, that they can no longer access the information that emotions carry. Emotions are data. They tell us when something is wrong, when a relationship is damaging us, when we need help, when we are not okay. A person who has been trained from childhood to suppress that signal doesn't just stop performing emotion, they gradually lose access to what they actually feel. The inheritance nobody talks about. We spend a great deal of time in conversations about old money, talking about what gets passed down financially. the trusts, the portfolios, the estates, the family name. But there is another inheritance, invisible, unacknowledged, and arguably more consequential, that gets transmitted alongside the financial one. It is the emotional template, the relational blueprint, the deeply held pre-conscious belief that vulnerability is weakness, that emotional need is shameful, that the correct response to pain is to compose yourself and carry on. This inheritance doesn't show up in a will. It doesn't require a lawyer. It doesn't need to be structured or planned. It passes automatically, from parent to child, through every interaction that withholds warmth, every boarding school drop-off, every dinner table where the correct form of conversation is practiced and genuine feeling is not, every nanny who replaced a mother, every cane that replaced a conversation, and it is self-perpetuating in the most ironic way possible. The very traits that the system is designed to produce, composure, self-sufficiency, emotional restraint, are the traits that make it impossible for the next generation to receive the emotional attunement they need. The emotionally unavailable parent cannot give what they were never given. The cycle continues not because anyone is malicious, but because the system was designed so effectively that the damage it causes looks, from the inside, exactly like success. Until we can recognize this as a form of group trauma, we will not be able to deal with its grave incapacity when it comes to empathy with the lives of others. This is perhaps the most important sentence in all the academic literature on this subject. Because the emotional coldness of old money doesn't just affect the families themselves. These are the people who have historically run governments, commanded armies, managed institutions, and shaped policy. A ruling class that cannot access empathy, that has had its capacity for genuine human connection systematically trained out of it, is not a ruling class that will govern well. The emotional damage of the boarding school system, the nanny culture, the stiff upper lip ideal, these are not private family matters. They have shaped history. Breaking the cycle. Is it possible? The picture painted so far is genuinely dark, and it would be irresponsible to leave it there without asking the obvious question: can this cycle be broken? Can someone raised in this system, or someone who recognizes these patterns in their own family, do something different? The answer, supported by everything we know about psychology and human development, is yes. But it requires something that old money culture has historically been almost incapable of: acknowledgement. You cannot heal a wound you insist is not there. And old money culture's central defense mechanism, the insistence that emotional restraint is strength, that composure is virtue, that the system produced successful people and therefore cannot be questioned, makes acknowledgement extraordinarily difficult. But the cracks are visible. Across the Western world, the culture of emotional suppression has been slowly losing its grip. The generation of parents who went through the boarding school system and emerged with their own unprocessed damage are increasingly choosing, consciously and with great effort, to do things differently for their children, to be present, to say the things that were never said to them, to allow their children to feel what they feel without the weight of class expectation demanding that it be managed away. Everyone gets a good education, everyone works, and no one inherits a lot of money at a young age. It is essential for people to make their own way in the world and to learn to stand on their own 2 feet, financially, emotionally, and intellectually. That last word matters, emotionally. The recognition that emotional self-sufficiency Real emotional intelligence, real capacity for relationship, is something that must be developed, not suppressed, represents a genuine break from the old money tradition. It is the beginning of an answer. The cycle of inherited emotional coldness is broken the same way most intergenerational cycles are broken, with someone who decides that the cost is too high and that the children who come after them deserve something different. That love is not indulgence. That warmth is not weakness. That a child who is held, seen, and heard grows into an adult who can hold, see, and hear others. And that this, not the estate, not the portfolio, not the family name, is the inheritance that actually matters. Old money families are often described as cold, as distant, as emotionally unavailable in a way that is both consistent and somehow, from the outside, even glamorous. That composed, untouchable quality that looks so much like confidence. But now you know what it actually is. It is the compounded result of centuries of institutional emotional suppression, of children sent away too young, of parents who were themselves never shown how to give what their children needed, of a culture that defined feeling as weakness and produced, generation after generation, adults who are masters of the performance of life and strangers to the experience of it. The stiff upper lip is not strength. It is a scar, and scars, unlike wounds, tend to last forever, unless someone, somewhere in the line, decides to finally let them heal. If this video gave you something to think about wealth, about family, about the things we inherit that no one ever intended to give us, please like and subscribe. Drop a comment below and tell me, which part of this hit closest to home? More content like this is coming. See you in the next one.